Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for History Value Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Dominic Crossan, and today we're going to be talking about one of his many books that he's published, The First Paul, Reclaiming the Radical Visionary Behind the Church's Conservative Icon. So, Dr. Crossan, when you say that the reader can meet Paul again for the first time, what do you mean by that? Like, what kind of new experience would one get from understanding the earliest version of Paul in Christianity? Because I know that you have Paul's letters, you got the Book of Acts, and the Book of Acts has different views, and you talk about that a lot in the book.
Well, you always have the whole answer in the subtitle, Jacob, because there's a huge amount of damage control has been exercised in Paul for the last 2,000 years, starting within the New Testament itself, which raises a question we have to get into in this program. What's so wrong with Paul? We have to keep fixing him up. We kind of know the same thing happened to Jesus. You got Mark, you got Matthew, Luke, and John. And in one sense, you got four accounts of one person. So there's a fair amount of damage control going on. But our focus today is on Paul. And what we were trying to do is, for me, for example, growing up in Ireland, the first time I ever heard of Paul, it was Peter and Paul. Say that as if it was all one word, Peter and Paul. I never heard of Paul. I didn't grow up in a Protestant community influenced by the Reformation. So it was always Peter and Paul. Like they were all. Well, I thought of it as a kid when we went to cowboy movies. There was always a cowboy and the sidekick. So I had no problem. Peter was kind of like the hero, and there had to be a sidekick. So Paul was some kind of a sidekick. And the first time I ever stood in front of St. Peter's Cathedral, that was 1959. First thing I saw in front of St. Peter's was a statue of Peter on my left looking at it, and Paul on my right. It seems like I can't get a good look at Paul. He's always kind of hidden behind Peter. So part of what we're trying to get at is, put it bluntly, what's wrong with Paul? Why from the beginning does he have so much trouble? So in that book, I was focusing primarily on that question. What's so wrong with Paul? Why do we have to have the pseudo-Pauline letters written after his death, which are really anti-Paul? I think they're trying to de-radicalize him or re-Romanize him. And then you have Luke doing the same thing. And then I get all the way to my Roman Catholic tradition in Ireland of Peter and Paul. I want to say that as if there was one word, Peter and Paul. Never, ever did I hear of Paul and Peter. It was always that way. So that sets up the problem for me.
And when you look at the Book of Acts and you compare the way Paul is portrayed in Acts to Paul in the Epistles, how different would you say it really is?
Let me say the maximum possible. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not talking about minor details. I really amn't. Paul's integrity, Paul's identity, Paul's authority stands or falls, as he says, in that I have seen the Lord. That puts him in a vision. Of course, he saw him. He never saw him in Galilee. He saw Jesus in the vision and was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. That's his whole identity. Along comes Acts, and it gives three magnificent accounts, dramatic. They're your dream if you're trying to make a movie about Paul. Three different accounts, Acts 9, Acts 22, 26, three different accounts of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Perfect. He's on the road. He's in between, and he's being converted. Now, they're great. And if there were simply dramatic license, I would never even criticize Paul. If it was simply a matter based on what happened. But the key thing in those three things is that Paul never sees the Lord. He hears him. It's not a vision, it's an audition. He hears the Lord, and he doesn't even get who it is. He says, "Who are you?" that wipes him out as an apostle. Magnificently, Paul is not an apostle. Therefore, he's not on a par with Peter and the others. He is subordinate to them. And that's the whole purpose of what Luke is doing. So it's not picking on minor details. Did he get converted in Damascus? Was he really knocked, as all the artists show off his horse? All of that is a poetic license. But to say that Paul didn't see the Lord is to wipe him off the map. And that's the purpose of it. He's a great missionary, by all means. He's busy running across the Roman Empire. There's just one thing he ain't, says Luke. He ain't an apostle. And of course, if he's not an apostle, he can't be the apostle of the Gentiles. That's Peter. So the first act of damage control, which I didn't recognize as a kid growing up in Ireland, is in the Acts of the Apostles when it's Peter, who's the apostle of the Gentiles for Luke. So that's what's at issue.
Do you think the author of Acts had different sources that made him think this, or was he coming up with the stuff on his own, or a mixed bag of both?
There's lots of scholars whom I respect, and I think are probably right, that Luke may have had the epistles, at least the authentic epistles, or at least he may have had a travel log of where Paul went. So no, the problem is not at all that Luke has bad information. He just has, I'm tempted to say misinterpretation. From a Pauline point of view, it's misinterpretation. It really is. From a Lucan point of view, writing maybe the beginning of the 2nd century, it's Lucan interpretation. So excellent Pauline information. And okay, I'm going to give my own judgment in honor of Paul. Bad Lucan interpretation. Because Paul is an apostle. If he isn't, I don't know who he is. He's just running around making claims that have no substantiation. Luke knows exactly what he's doing. One of the things I did, honestly, Jacob, was when I was working on Paul, I had some extra time. I took about a year off and said, can I forget about Paul? Let's say Paul never existed. I just want to focus on Luke. What makes Luke tick? What's Luke about? And that's really Luke Acts. And I try and see why he puts Paul in there. The first thing you have to do is not dip in and out of Luke Acts and say, like this, keep it, don't like that, like a buffet. You have to figure out, what is Luke up to? Writing at the beginning of the 2nd century, at least 50, 60 years after Paul is dead, Luke knows exactly what he's doing. And he's doing it to Paul. So it's not ignorance, it's not mistake, it's nothing like that. It's a different theological purpose.
How would you look at the basket escape scene in the book of Acts? Some scholars notice, this is strange. Paul's being lured on a basket in a different decade than in the book of Acts than he is in 2 Corinthians. And it seems to describe the event completely differently from 2 Corinthians.
Thank you. That's the perfect example that I had in the back of my mind. I was hoping you'd bring up. I look in 2010, the Borgs and the Crossans were both in Damascus. It was about the last year you could get in without a flak jacket and taking your life in your own hands. And we went to the gate where they will show you exactly, and they'll show you a picture, and there's crosses on the gate, and they'll show you exactly what had happened. Now, let me look at the account. Again, this is a perfect example. You have it in Acts chapter 9, Luke's version, and in 2 Corinthians. And by the way, we only get it from Paul because he's kind of laughing at himself. The Romans had a special decoration, let's say the Corona Moralis, for the first trooper in over the wall into a besieged city. First into the besieged city. Paul is kind of laughing at himself. I was first out of the city. So he's laughing at himself. That's the only reason he tells us the story in 2 Corinthians. But he tells us that he's escaping from Aretas. That's Aretas IV of the Nabateans, capital down at Petra. He's escaping from him, and that makes absolute sense because from other sources, Josephus, for example, we can figure out that Aretas IV made a drive north after the death of Herod Philip to go all the way to Damascus, to grab Damascus, as actually one of his predecessors, the Aretas III, had. So it makes sense what Paul says. He's a Jewish missionary in an Arab country when Antipas, the Jew, is at war with Aretas, the Arab. He's in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong purpose in Arabia. Okay, all of that makes sense. Along comes Luke. Luke says the Jews, quotation, the Jews wanted to kill Paul and were guarding the gates to get him. Now, with all due respect, historically speaking, the kindest thing you could say about that is it's what? Fiction? You could say a lie. You could say anti-Jewish. The Jews were not guarding and never could guard the gates of Damascus. Ever. To kill Paul. It's part of the dangerous anti-Judaism latent in Luke Acts and very delicately there, but very definitely there. So again, it's not a case of, well, he says the Nabateans and he says the Jews. Well, we don't know what's going on. Maybe some scholars will say he escaped twice, different baskets, different windows. Come on. It makes absolute sense within Luke's own theology, written in the early 2nd century, to denigrate the Jewish background of Messianic Christianity. It fits in with what he does in many other places. Go all the way back to chapter 4 of Luke. The first day of Jesus is not a day of great success at Nazareth. At Capernaum. That's what you get in Mark, his source. It's a day of disaster when he's almost killed by the Jews in his own hometown. People should read Luke Acts very, very carefully.
Would you say that the book of Acts not only significantly contradicts Paul's life and his epistles, but it also contradicts his theology?
Oh, yes. I mean, to be honest with you, Jacob, if you take away Paul's apostolic identity, you can kiss his theology goodbye. At least, why should anyone listen to it? I mean, you could say, well, he's a maverick, and therefore I will respect his theology in any case. But you see, I don't know if Paul's authentic letters would have got into the New Testament if it wasn't so set up that as you're reading through it, you read Luke Acts first. Right? At least you read Acts about Paul. Now, the thing is that once Luke has described something, believe me, you'll never get it out of your mind. It's almost impossible. It really is for me even to concentrate on what I think did happen, that Paul was converted in Damascus, because I think that's where he was located. I don't think for a second he came commissioned by the high priestly authorities to pick up Jews and bring them back to Jerusalem again. That's not even believable fiction in the 1st century. The Romans had a few ideas about anyone running renditions in the 1st century. So when you have stuff like that, you have to ask yourself what's going on. You really do. So I understand Luke. He makes eminent sense to me, and he is consistently, thoroughly Lucan. So you can expect what's going to happen in Luke, but it's not Paul, and that's the whole point I want to make.
Did the author of the book of Acts reject Paul's epistles?
Reject. Well, if he had read them, he had to get, at least from there, he knows where Paul was. I mean, he's not making it up. Most of the places he mentions, Paul mentions both of them. There's some places he mentions, like he says Paul was born in Tarsus. Paul never mentions that, but I don't see any reason to dispute it. It's not like he's saying he was born in Alexandria. And Luke does like to up the academic resume of people. Paul is not just a Pharisee, he's a son of Pharisees. He's not just educated, he's educated by Gamaliel in Jerusalem. Paul, for Luke, has gone to Harvard, as it were. So I know there's a certain upgrading of him, but still, the theology is totally different. I mean, it's a de-radicalized Paul. Yeah, I think even if you were to say, okay, grant him he's not an apostle, but maybe his theology is better than any of the apostles. Maybe you might say that. But I don't think he'd be in the New Testament if he wasn't bracketed, as it were, between Acts, which kind of trains you to think about Paul. Then you get Paul, say Romans, for example. Then on the other side, you get the pseudo-Pauline epistles. So he is, if I could pun on the word, framed by anti-Pauline. Now, I'm not just saying these were people after Paul, and, they're saying if Paul was here now, here'd be his opinion on this. Like a benign Pauline school, it's an anti-Pauline school. It's a process, as I've said before, of de-radicalization. So yeah, he pretty much rejects his basic theology.
What do you think about the we narrative in Acts? Some scholars say that the we narrative that starts in Acts 16, the shift from third to first person, is an indicator that the author of Acts had stitched a different document together with his Acts of the Apostles, a document that's much earlier. What do you think about that?
I think that's right. I think he has not a document, maybe, because that's a fuzzy word for a moment. I think what he has actually is somebody who was with Paul and left behind a travel log. Let me give a kind of a stupid example from my own experience. We took a Pauline tour, the Borgs and the Crossans, about 15 times across Turkey. We always started off with a travel log, day 1, the place, day 2, the place, day 3, the place. Then as we went, we filled that out as we went there, what happened. At the end, we had a pretty full account for ourselves of what we did every day. And sometimes the days got turned around. So a travel log is went to here, took say. I think that's what he has. So when Paul, for example, is at Miletus and gives a speech at Miletus, by the way, he sails into Miletus, which is something you won't do today because the Turkish coast is heading for Greece in more ways than one. So I don't think the speech he gave there, this is the skeletal structure. And I think you can figure out what happened. I think Paul at Alexandria Troas meets somebody from Philippi. And that's when I think if you had to give a name, I'm making this up. If you had to give a name to the person, I'd call him Philip, but I'm making that up. He's from Philippi. He goes with Paul, probably sponsors him in a way, picks him up again, and is with Paul. So in terms of geography, in terms of sequence of places, I trust the we sequence very much, but only as a travelogue, not what happens there. But I think it's precious because it gives us a travelogue, and that's the armature, the skeletal frame upon which you can understand Luke's speeches that he adds.
Does the Council of Jerusalem in Acts fit the description of the same event in Galatians?
Yes, that's in one sense, that's where we should start. Paul in Galatians swears that what he's saying is true because what's happening in the Galatians, they are impugning his authority. They're saying in plain language, you're just a messenger boy from the Jerusalem or the Antioch church. You came here as a missionary under control of Jerusalem, and you're claiming you're not. You're claiming you're independent because you're equal to them. So in one sense, the Galatians pretty much said bluntly what Luke told more politely. They wiped out his authority, and therefore, why should we listen to you? You just got a nice opinion. Go away. So he has to do it under oath. And he does it. He swears under oath of what happened. And by the way, he does the same thing in 2 Corinthians. When Paul is attacked and gives his autobiography defensively, polemically, he swears to it. And yeah, I take that as close to truth as we can get. So now, what you have in Acts 15 is a smokescreen. Okay, I'm using kind of blunt language because we're talking in a hurry. It's a polished job. It's damage control. Everything is lovely. If you could imagine a Roman authority, I don't imagine this, reading this, you say, these are lovely people. They have a kind of a little senate. They have a problem. They all come together and discuss it. They have a nice discussion. No controversy. Nobody calls anyone foolish Galatians or nasty names. And then at the end, the leader, who's James, kind of looks at the consensus, writes it all up in a letter, and sends it out. What a lovely bunch of people. They're so calm. No tumult here. We don't have to worry about these, whatever they're called, Christians or whatever they're called. They're kind of like us, law and order people. They run a nice little seminar almost. Now, if you read Galatians, what you find is the truth, that there was a serious problem between, let me use the terms, conservatives and liberals. And we may find what they're debating completely antiquated, but we have the same problems in the church, just different focuses. And at the council, if you want to call it that term, in Galatians, you find out that there is a split. Let me put that in quotation marks for the moment. Let me back up. A division, a practical division of labor, a compromise, that Peter and the 12 will go to the Jews and mission to the Jews. Barnabas and Paul, notice the order, by the way, Barnabas and Paul will go to the Gentiles. Now, that's a lovely compromise. It's what you might expect from a committee. How are you going to do that? Because every city will have Jews and Gentiles. If all the Gentiles were over in the west and all the Jews were over in the east, it would be lovely. Barnabas and Paul go west, Peter goes east. What's going to happen at Antioch when there's Jews and Gentiles, and both Peter is talking to the Jews, Paul to the Gentiles, and when they want to have a Eucharist together, a meal? Is it kosher for everyone? Or is it kosher for nobody? How do you do that? So what you really see at that moment, and the date is round, put a round number on to say 50, that division of labor is when the die is cast and the Rubicon or the Jordan is crossed and the future is inevitable. Now, it hasn't happened at that moment, and it would horrify Paul to know what's going to happen. But these two groups are going to end up going their separate ways.
So would you say that the author of Acts is trying to essentially clean up the heated arguments in Galatians and in other Pauline epistles?
Yes, and does a perfect job of it. I mean, if we didn't have Paul, why would anyone question that? It sounds they have a problem, they discuss it, everything seems lovely. Why not? It could be. You don't see it there. And the reason, I mean, there's a reason for Luke. He's been quite consistent. He wants to make certain, okay, he's writing at the beginning of the 2nd century. By the beginning of the 2nd century, Josephus and Tacitus have given us a narrative, a brief narrative of who Christians are. They're followers of somebody who was crucified over there against Roman law and order under Tiberius by Pilate. Now, anyone reading that is going to say, these guys sound like a bunch we should get rid of. I mean, they're followers of a guy we had to crucify. Now, it's kind of true that usually that stops them when we crucify their leader, but hey, they're still around 50 years later. At the beginning of the 2nd century, Rome, that's the aristocracy, the government. Now, they're not persecuting Christians, but they have a basic narrative about them, which I would construe as keep an eye on those guys. They're still around, and we don't quite know why they're still around, but they're still around. Now, in the 2nd century, lots of Christian philosophers would write philosophy apologetically against Rome and say, in effect, quite rightly, well, you guys have no trouble with somebody rising up from the dead and going off to heaven. Your emperors, for example. What's wrong with us saying it about our Jesus? We're doing the same as you do. That's philosophy. What Luke is doing, Luke Acts, is writing a counter narrative. He's trying to control the messianic Christic narrative. Not the way you guys say, we are lovely people. We never cause any trouble. There are riots, it's true, but that's the jealous Jews or the greedy pagans. It's not us. Look at the way we conduct ourselves. And every Roman official that Jesus or Paul or Peter runs into says, these guys are innocent. It's a perfect storm of innocence. That's the theme of Luke Acts. That's his whole purpose. It's a magnificent counter-narrative, apologia pro vita Christiana, as it were. And it's the first great step towards Constantine. That's Luke Acts, but it ain't Paul.
What do you think that Paul means when he says that he was crucified with Christ in Galatians?
All right. Let me go back for a moment to the way baptism is described in Paul. You go down into I don't want to say the baptismal font, it won't work. You go down into the baptismal grave. You're buried with Christ. So you rise up the other side, reborn. Now, we've heard that, born again, beaten the metaphor to death. But what Paul is saying, Christ died by the Roman Empire to the Roman Empire. You are now dying to the Roman Empire. That sounds lovely. But imagine now you and I are living in America, and supposing we were told by baptism you have died to the American Empire. And for example, if you're at a football match and everyone stands up, you don't stand up. So what Paul is trying to tell them is not just a general nice feeling, you've died to the Roman Empire. So there's consequences for that. And you see them in the baptismal formula, neither male nor female, neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free. In plain language, if you're a Christian, you can't have a Christian slave. So you begin to sense, when you really read Paul and try to understand him, why it will need so much damage control. If he wasn't radical, you wouldn't need to de-radicalize him.
And would you say that this de-radicalizing continued in much later pseudo-Pauline epistles like 3 Corinthians, Laodiceans, etc.?
Yeah, I think it goes all the way up to... The immediate ones are this, I think. The first letters like Colossians and Ephesians, I mean, in one sense, they're just starting. I mean, they've no problem with Pauline theology. In fact, their Jesus is even more transcendental than in Paul. But as Jesus becomes more and more transcendental, his feet leave the earth. So I don't want to talk about social consequences. It's part of the gospel, for example, about neither slave nor free. It's not a sort of a social consequence tagged on, but the real theology is about heaven or something. No, so when Colossians and Ephesians say, of course, Christians can have slaves, take it for granted. But, slaves should obey their masters, and the masters shouldn't brutalize their slaves, which is certainly right, of course. But Paul said they shouldn't have slaves. That's the whole point of Philemon. So they're already compromising on Paul. And by the time you get to Timothy and Titus, even more so. By the time you get to Luke, I think Luke is even more radical because he simply negates that Paul is an apostle. So it doesn't really matter what he says. At least in the pseudo-Pauline epistles, they always concede he's an apostle because they want to, in a way, turn his apostolic authority against itself. So the progression I see keeps going all the way to, by the 4th century, you can say it's consummated, because when we get to Rome, this is after Constantine, we want Petrus et Paulus, the hero twins of Christian Rome, to replace Romulus et Remus. It's kind of nice, the P's and the R's, they kind of go together. So Petrus and Paulus replacing Romulus and Remus. At least they didn't kill one another. So we want them back together. That's why you get those images from the 400s of Peter and Paul hugging one another. There's a famous belt buckle, an ivory belt buckle from Stabia that went down under the Vesuvius eruption in 79, and they're embracing one another. Now, okay, that's lovely, but they wouldn't be embracing one another unless they needed to embrace one another. In other words, reconciliation. So this is the final act in the cleanup of getting Peter and Paul in that order, of course, with all due respect, but always in that order. We'll even put them together in that order, and they're now the hero twins of Christian Rome. That's the last great, in a way, act in the cleanup, you could say, of the Peter and Paul.
And how would you look at the differences between the way Paul describes the resurrection of Christ to the Gospels?
All right, let me back off for a while, because this is going to need some. In the 1st century world, leave Paul out for a moment. In the 1st century world, there was 2 mighty metaphors for the vindication of somebody. I want to use a neutral term. Cross-culturally, it was accepted by Jews, Greeks, and Romans that an individual, if they had done something of extraordinary merit, could be taken up, a human individual, taken up among the gods or to God. So Moses, for example, was taken up to God, and so was Romulus, founder of Judaism, if you want to say, and founder of Romanism. They were taken up to God. That was a cross-cultural understanding. You could deny that this person, I suppose somebody could say, I don't believe in Moses, but I believe in Romulus. And you could certainly say, if you talked about Jesus, you could deny he was. Well, we're talking about ascension, apotheosis, the Greek word, your divinization. That was a cross-cultural concept in the 1st century. Nobody could deny its possibility. They might deny its actuality for your guy or our guy, but it could happen. Now, leave that aside, ascension, and talk about resurrection. That was totally different. Resurrection was a Pharisaic term within Judaism. Not even all Jews accepted it. Resurrection meant, this is what the word meant. Resurrection meant, said the Pharisees, maybe about 150 years before the time of Jesus and on, at the end of time, there's going to be a great big universal resurrection of everyone who ever lived, for a general judgment of everyone who ever lived, and then you go to heaven or hell. So think of it as resurrection meant resurrection, judgment, sanction. That's what it meant. If you use resurrection in the 1st century, that's what it meant. If you wanted to talk about ascension, that's something different. The extraordinary thing is, if you try to imagine, let's imagine for a moment, the visions that happened after the death of Jesus. And I think those are historical events, visions, whether they all happened on Easter Sunday or something else. the extraordinary question is, why didn't it go for ascension? And that's what everyone would have expected. You had visions of Jesus, and if you even want to say we found the empty tomb, sure, he's gone up to God. Of course. Somebody might deny it happened, but they couldn't deny it could happen. It could happen. Now, where did resurrection come from? Resurrection is the Pharisaic belief that someday, at least at the end of time, there's going to be a great act of cosmic justice. Now, please let me hit that. An act of cosmic justice. For myself, I find the idea of a general resurrection at the end of time embarrassing to the point of absurdity. But whether there is cosmic justice, I find that terribly serious. And I'm not thinking at all, I really am it, of a divine punishment. I am thinking profoundly of human consequences. I don't think what we're doing to the earth means we're being punished by God. And so we can all say, well, I don't believe in God, let's say, so why should I worry about punishments and forgiveness and mercy? Take evolution seriously. Take the rising waters seriously. Take the pollution of the earth seriously, because there is a cosmic justice in consequences for what we do. And it has nothing whatsoever to do with the end of time. It's going on right now. So when I listen to Paul the Pharisee, I have no evidence that I'm certain of that anyone used resurrection for Jesus before Paul. Ascension, like you have, for example, in the Transfiguration, which is a typical ascension scene, I think that's where it started, ascension for Jesus. Then I think Paul brought in the idea of resurrection, and then he had to say, of course, the only thing he could say is that Paul started the general resurrection. There's no such thing as an individual resurrection. And that tells me that Paul is claiming that the great cosmic justice has already begun. And I don't know any way not to find that true. And it has nothing to do with whether you believe in theism or atheism or monotheism or polytheism. It depends on whether you take evolution seriously and the consequences of what we do on Earth.
When do you date the pseudo-Pauline epistles such as Ephesians, Colossians, Titus, 2 Thessalonians 1 and 2 Timothy?
Okay, I'll answer that, but I'm going to make a request. We have been marvelous, we scholars, in diffusing real questions by asking, no, let me put it back. We've been great at diffusing major questions by focusing on minor questions. It's a perfectly valid question, when was Colossians written? Perfectly valid. And you can probably write a book on it. But what I'm afraid all the time is these minor questions, I was going to say distract scholars. I don't think it's just distraction. There's a safety in it. I can debate Colossians anytime from the 90s, the 110s, and, make scholarly, profound arguments, and never ask what they're doing to Paul, why it's necessary to have pseudo-Pauline epistles. So by all means, think of them at the end of the first century or the beginning of the second century. But don't just ask those questions. I'm not talking to you, Jacob. I'm talking to my fellow scholars. Ask those questions, get them out of your system, and then ask certain questions I'm asking. Why resurrection? Anastasis is the Greek word, rather than ascension, apotheosis. Why go with the Pharisaic? It's Jewish only in the sense of a Jewish sectarian group. That doesn't make it wrong. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that when you're interpreting something, for example, be it an empty tomb or visions, the easiest thing for them to have gone, and I think that's what happened, is with ascension. Jesus has been taken up to God. I think any Roman, open-minded Roman, who was reading Mark, I doubt if any of them did it, but let's imagine it, and he reads a story of an empty tomb, he would think these guys are making a claim that their guy Jesus has been taken up to God, or the gods, whichever way he wants to put it. Now, he might laugh at it, but he would understand it. He wouldn't say, "Oh, empty tomb. Wow." He might go with, the body has been stolen. Of course, that's the alternative. But if he didn't go with that, he said, well, these people are making a claim that Jesus has ascended or been assumed, and he would use the word apotheosis. He's been assumed to God, and then he would try and understand that. He might deny it, he might laugh at it, he might mock it, but he would understand it. Now, if somebody said resurrection, the first thing any open-minded Roman would do, or even Jew might scratch their head and say, resurrected? That's supposed to happen at the end of time when everyone rises together. You're telling me Jesus? Then they might remember, wait a minute, there's that weird thing in Matthew where it looks like other people arose with Jesus. Are you telling me that the general resurrection has begun? Oh, what does that mean? That's exactly, of course, what Paul says in Corinthians 15. Jesus has risen as the first fruits of the general resurrection. So Paul's claim, and here's the way I take it with absolute seriousness, Paul's claim is that the great cosmic justice has already begun. And that means for me that every day since our species came out of Africa and declared and launched war on the world, on the environment, on other species, and on ourselves, we've been moving towards heaven or hell day after day. We've been creating heaven and hell. Because I take that scenario back from end time, which, whatever, back into time, and I see it all around us. We're looking at the consequences right now. I'm speaking from Florida after the last hurricane. You can see it on the evening news. And quite frankly, war is only one part of it. In the Bible, they were mostly concerned about war. They never took seriously that anyone could destroy the earth except God. God wouldn't do that because that would be embarrassing. That would be like, saying that your creation was a mistake. So God would never destroy the earth. Tried it once, but said it was a mistake, the deluge. So nobody in the biblical tradition ever imagined that we could destroy the earth. So there's, it's not in there. What is in there is that wars could destroy local parts of the earth. What we have to face now is that our species, as I said, came out of Africa and launched an attack on our environment. And there are consequences. And you don't get away from them by simply saying, well, maybe God doesn't exist. Yeah, but evolution does.
To conclude this conversation, how would you say one should read and analyze the book of Acts?
I think, let me start with the negative. If you're interested in Paul and kind of dip into Acts to help your understanding of Paul and kind of use it like a buffet. So, for example, here he is with Gallio, and we know Gallio was in Corinth at 51. So we know Paul was at Corinth at 51. Don't do that. Don't do that. Leave Paul aside if you're primarily interested in Paul, and spend a year or so studying Luke Acts, a 2-volume work conceived, written, published in the early decades of the 2nd century as a unit. And try and figure out, it's not that hard to do, really. Once you put them together, it's quite clear. What's Luke up to? Why does he do what he does? Forget whether you like it or not. Why does he do what he does? And then I would say respect him, because he's the only person in the entire New Testament that got the future right. I don't care what you think about Constantine, but he said it's coming, and he was right. He said the future is Roman Christianity, not Jewish Christianity. Again, for better or worse, he was right. No, the world didn't end or anything else. So understand it. Then within that context, you can see why he would use Paul the way he does. Almost everything then falls into shape. He's not making mistakes, I said. He is reinterpreting, drastically reinterpreting. I would say, quite frankly, misinterpreting. Misinterpreting, if I'm looking backwards for Paul, maybe you could say he's not misinterpreting because he's adjusting to the future. He's adjusting to the future. Okay, but I do not follow Luke Acts on, for example, the first day of Jesus. He's not almost killed by his fellow Nazareth people. No. And I don't think Paul was almost killed by Jews at Damascus. So there's a way to read Luke Acts, and there's a way not to read Luke Acts. And you should know that, but don't use it like a buffet. Take this, I'll keep it, take that. Have a consistent interpretation throughout that helps you understand what Luke Acts is doing, and then find out that he is absolutely consistent to himself.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Crossan.
Always a pleasure, Jacob, and hello to everyone out there.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.